Well, welcome again as we continue our look into Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And as I've noted previously, that the first three chapters deal with the unique dynamics of the relationship that we have with Christ, how that the transformation that Christ brings into our life is we go from being outside of the family of God into the family of God. And part of what we need to understand is that this is a unique and honored position, that just the very fact that I can confess myself as a Christian and know that I've been saved puts me in a unique category in terms of the rest of the world. So that the church, or the body of Christ, which is composed with multiple individuals, is this wonderful, unique community that God created for us to learn how to love Him and grow together in that love for Him. And that's why essentially the goal is always to develop a unity in the faith. Now, unity is a difficult thing many times because we find that different people have different ways of looking at things or feeling about things. We have our minds operate differently, and this is probably no more true than in the relationship of husbands and wives. One of the great faults oftentimes in marriage is we look at the other person and don't understand why they think the way they think. In fact, I've told women many times that you may think your husband has only half a brain, and to some degree that actually is true. And I'll have to wait till a later date to explain why that is. But the simple fact is that a man and woman can look at exactly the same object and see it through a different set of eyes. And even though they're seeing the same thing, their brain is processing it in a very completely different way. When you can appreciate this about the other person, then you can basically value their perspective as much as your own, and suddenly you have a fuller view of things and you can make more progress in just about everything that you deal with in life. But here is really the underlying problem. Some years ago, the research was done on why people went through divorce. And one of the things they found in observing the way couples talk to each other in a private setting is that when there's contempt in the part of one person towards the other, or even both person to each other, then the chances of that marriage surviving go down very quickly. And I think this is why, as we looked last Friday, where Paul begins by saying in verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, he tells us that we need to really look at the other person as being as valuable as we are. We're to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And some people think that I have to have no love for myself in order to be available to love other people. But the simple fact is that the things that I learn about myself and in my own journey are really the resources that help me to love other people better. It was Robin Williams who said that oftentimes comedians like to make people laugh and to make them happy is because they themselves are so unhappy that they understand what it means to be unhappy. And I thought, well, that's really quite an insight, really, because you think about it, when God takes you through difficult things in your life and you feel the pain and hurt and disappointment of life, we often look at that as being a bad thing, that God made a mistake and allowed that to touch my life, when in fact, those are often some of the tools that God uses to teach us how to be compassionate and empathetic enough to be able to minister God's grace and love to other people. And that's interesting. I love the passage in Matthew's gospel where it says that Jesus sees the multitudes coming to him, and he said he had compassion on them because he saw them as being like sheep without a shepherd. Now, he could have looked at them through a lot of different lenses. He could have seen them as being the unwashed mass, this chaotic rabble. He could have said, these people are always wanting something from me, and I'm getting so sick and tired of having them press in on me and touch me and make my life hard and uncomfortable. Can't I have a little peace and quiet once in a while? Can't they learn how to bring their own lunch when they're traveling around the country? I mean, these are all things that just come to my mind, which may tell you something about how bad my mind is. But the simple fact is that Jesus saw them in a different lens. Although there was a variety of ways that he could have looked at them, he's telling us, as God who's become man, this is how I look at you. I have compassion on you, and when you're going astray and going in the wrong direction or making the wrong decisions and the wrong choices, I don't hate you for that, but I recognize that you're a sheep who's gone astray, and it's my goal to bring you back into the fold, back into the relationship with God. In a sense, that's what the whole structure of the Word of God is all about. As we read through the Scriptures, we realize that God is trying to instruct me on how to live within the fold of God's family. And that's where we pick up our conversation today. It becomes so critical because you can't really have a meaningful relationship with another person unless you're willing to submit to them in the sense that you recognize that they have needs and that you have a responsibility to try to respond positively to those needs. And this can be incredibly complicated, particularly in a world where we find that narcissistic and sociopathic behavior is increasing exponentially, so that we have a lot of conflict going on in our culture. But most of all, what he tells us in this chapters 5 and chapter 6, as he goes from the wide aspects of loving other people and living in unity, and begins to narrow our focus down to the 3 areas that are most critical for our personal happiness and what we might call a successful life. The first one is marriage. There's no more important relationship in your life than being married, which is kind of troubling in our times because we see people are avoiding marriage because they think that when you get married, the good times end. When in fact, when you get married, and especially when you have kids, you really begin to understand what's most valuable, the value of relationships. You begin to understand how you can love someone more deeply than you ever thought you could love them. And so the whole issue of marriage is a critical one that we'll be talking about probably for at least the next couple of weeks. And I suspect that many of you would be happy to hear that, because if there's anything I hear a lot of is the stress in marriages, particularly before and during and after the holiday season. The holiday season tends to put a whole lot of stresses on relationships that really become critical later on in the year. So we're going to spend some time talking about marriage, and it's important. There's really no more important gift or greater gift that you can give to your kids than a happy, loving marriage. Because I'm dealing with people who are getting divorced, and they have no sensitivity for the terrible impact that has upon kids. You know, my parents stayed together for my brother and I's sake. We pleaded with them not to get a divorce, and so they stayed together. And it wasn't a happy marriage, and in no way can I say that I would want to have a marriage like that. In fact, before I was a Christian, I decided marriage was not for me because I figured that would be the same kind of experience that I would have if I ever got married. Now I look back and realize not only was I not predestined to have that kind of a marriage, but I'm so thankful that I did get married, and I'm even more thankful through thick and thin, my wife and I have hung in there and stayed together, because it's really that continuing together that helps you to continue to grow together, both in your relationship with God and also your relationship with each other. And that becomes a testimony to your children. You know, your children look at that and say, divorce is not necessary or absolute, and that God has happiness and fulfillment that can come within the marriage and family relationship. So what Paul does, he first talks about the marriage and what that's supposed to look like. And then secondly, he talks about family life. He talks about parents' relationship with their children, with children's relationship with their parents. And there, in all of these, there's a reciprocity, if you will. There's a responsibility that I have to you. There's a responsibility you have to me. And then finally, he gets into the area of what I call the marketplace, or the work areas of your life. Even though in the context of chapter 6, he talks about a slave and his relationship to his master and vice versa. The point is that that's really the same dynamic that exists for us when we are an employer or an employee. If you have a job, you probably have somebody who is the authority in that job over you, and you're accountable to them. And that's the idea of slaves and masters was much like that. And so many of the principles are very applicable. And the same way as if you're a boss, you're an employer, and you have people working for you, you likewise have a responsibility to them. And all of this takes on a heightened concern or care when we're talking about being Christians. So here again, we come back to these 3 most critical areas of our life. These are the areas where we're going to find our greatest joys and fulfillments and satisfaction in life. Secondly, they're also the areas where we'll have probably our most difficult struggles. We'll go through a lot of pain and hardship and conflict. But one of the things we must never forget is that relationships are essential for personal happiness. one of the reasons why we find psychologists are now saying we have an epidemic of loneliness is because people have tried to live in a virtual reality. They've gone to a screening world where the people they interact with over the internet, and basically they're not having real human contact. So when we wear masks and we can't see what people are doing, I mean, I walk through a store and I can't tell if a person is smiling at me or they want to bite my neck. The truth of the matter is, there's a wall or a barrier that begins to separate and interfere with the ability to have relationship. The same thing is true when you talk about social distancing, or as I like to refer to it, anti-social distancing. That we need to be in a closer proximity. A conversation to be meaningful has to be within a gap of about 24 inches. And so, because so much of conversation is facial gestures, it is the tone in which we speak. There are subtle nuances of body language and other things that are part of the communication. And when we try to do that over video screens, well, let me see, how many of us have suffered through Zoom meetings and realized that they're interminably difficult and unfulfilling and not what you want to do? More than 5 minutes and I want to blow my brains out. But at the same time, these relationships, even though they're so important, they often are very fragile and can be shattered, particularly when more and more we find people don't possess the skills and the abilities how to have a healthy relationship. So that's what we're going to be looking at here today over the next couple of weeks, well, several weeks probably as we get into this. And it really begins with this idea of submitting to one another, that I take the attitude that I have a responsibility to be looking at their needs and not just simply caring for my own needs. I don't neglect my needs or pretend like I don't have needs. And sometimes we need to communicate them to somebody else so they understand that we have those needs. But at the same time, I have an obligation not just to make myself happy, but rather to love them in a way that is satisfactory and helps meet their needs as well. But way over time, I'll pick this up tomorrow as we continue looking more deeply in the idea of how is it that we go about building a fulfilling Christ-centered marriage relationship. Go in His grace. Pick this up tomorrow. Take care.